All right, I'd like to call this May 23rd, 2017 Shelburne Select Board meeting to order. We're starting a little early from our normally scheduled 7 o'clock start, 6 o'clock now. The reason we're doing this is because we have the privilege of welcoming Professor Stephanie Seguino from the University of Vermont, who was kind enough to come here. She has been doing some research. She'll explain more about the depth of her research. It is, and has written an article titled Driving While Black and Brown in Vermont. When we first heard of this, board and the town manager thought this was a topic that was of significant importance, and we wanted to immediately bring it to the town. We wanted to be open and transparent. If there are issues in Vermont and in Shelburne, we wanted to address them head on. So Joe, as town manager, reached out to Professor Seguino, who couldn't have been nicer, by the way. And she has graciously agreed to come and present. There will be an opportunity after her presentation for people to ask questions. Normally, our rules of procedure provide that all questions are directed to the board. But obviously, in this case, it's the professor who knows about her research and her article. So I asked her, and she agreed to answer people's questions. So if the board would join me on this, we would waive that rule, and so the questions can go directly, and we have a sense of the board. So I'd like to introduce to everyone Professor Stephanie Seguino.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and for your interest in this, and thank you all for being here. I've been working on this topic in Vermont for at least
Excuse me,
6 or 7
Stephanie, I'm
years.
sorry. We are on TV, as I
Yes.
said before. We have 2.5 million people watching.
Okay.
So if you could use the mic,
Yes.
that'd be great.
Yes.
Thanks.
So I've been working on this since roughly 2009, and the effort really began in the Burlington area. A number of citizens of color raised concerns around what they experienced as disparate policing from area police departments. And so a group was formed called Uncommon Alliance, which was a combination of members of the community of color as well as area police chiefs. At that time, there was no requirement that race data in traffic policing be collected in Vermont. So this was a voluntary effort. They began, this was the Vermont State Police, Burlington, Winooski, South Burlington, and UVM began collecting data. Subsequently, what happened was that the legislature passed a bill that required all police departments in Vermont to collect race data. And so the data were required to begin to be collected as of September 2014. And all departments were required to submit their data to the state on September 2016. So we analyzed this data. My colleague Nancy Brooks from Cornell University. We've previously analyzed Burlington data, South Burlington, Vermont State Police, and so forth. This particular report combines the data from all over the state and includes roughly the police departments that police roughly 78% of Vermont's population. Do you mind advancing that? Any luck? Okay. Can you go back? Yeah. Okay, great. So, I liken this process of understanding racial disparities in policing to going to the doctor and getting a diagnostic test. And I want to first start with, why do we look at police data? Well, one is because the police are a significant institution in our societies, along with our schools. And the police traffic stops are the most frequent interaction citizens have with the police, and the police have tremendous discretion on whom to stop, whether to give you a ticket or a warning, whether to arrest you or not, whether to search your vehicle or not, and so forth. And so we wanted to analyze this to see if, in fact, there was evidence to support the claim of a number of members of the community of color of disparate treatment by the police. And really, that earlier work had stumbled because there wasn't any evidence. And so this data collection effort was really to see, are there patterns in the data that tell us a consistent story? Now, one pattern in the data might be that you have several indicators, and in one indicator shows no racial disparities, one shows racial bias against minorities or racial favoritism towards minorities on another. That's not a consistent pattern. So what we're looking here for is a variety of indicators that evaluate police interactions with citizens by race, and to see if there is a consistent story. So I just want to remind you, data tell a story. And I'm going to share with you the patterns here, and I think that you'll see that the story is relatively consistent. And one of the things that happened in these data was that I wasn't able to get Shelburne data before the study was concluded. We were able to obtain it, I think, in March of this year, and so we did a subsequent analysis, and I'm going to report to you the Shelburne findings once I show you the state findings, and you'll see that the results are fairly similar. So just as when you go to the doctor and the doctor wants to see how you're doing, they do a series of diagnostic tests, they take your blood pressure, they weigh you, they take your temperature and so forth. Similarly, what we have is several indicators, no single one of which is evidence of racial disparities, but rather what we're looking at is what is the sum total of the evidence tell us. So we look at, first of all, racial shares of traffic stops. So for example, in Burlington, whites are 88% of the population. We would expect, on average then, that is, they're 88% of the driving population. We would estimate on average then, absent racial disparities, that whites would be 88% roughly of those who are stopped for traffic violations or for whatever. Similarly, if blacks are 4.5% of the population in Burlington, which they are, we would anticipate they would be 4.5% of the population and so forth. So we look to see if there is a correlation between the share of a group's share of traffic stops versus their share of the population. That's one indicator. And, but it's not, in fact, the most important or significant. What's also important is what happens after a traffic stop. Right? So police will sometimes say they can't identify the race of the driver before the stop. That's not always true. In fact, there are many instances which they can. But we know with certainty that once a driver has been stopped, the officer has formed a perception of the driver's race. And that's how the data is categorized. The officer indicates their perception of the race of the driver. So we look at a number of indicators post-stop. What percentage of blacks get a ticket versus a warning as compared to whites, Asians, and so forth. We look at arrest rates. Are arrest rates similar across racial groups? We would expect that they should be. Are search rates the same? And are hit rates the same? So hit rates are the percentage of searches that yield contraband. And I'll say a little bit more about these as I go through the data. So can you?
It's a very complicated laptop. I think it's the down button.
There you go.
Okay. So here's what we find at the state level. So this is combining all districts, and I'm going to show you some data for individual jurisdictions. But in any case, at the state level, what we find is that Black and Hispanic drivers are stopped at a rate that exceeds their share of the driving population. How do we measure the driving population? From Department of Motor Vehicles data on not at fault drivers. So we would assume that's an unbiased estimate of the racial shares of groups that are driving. We find that among drivers stopped, that Black and Hispanic drivers were also more likely to get a ticket than white drivers. Can you advance that? So I just want to show you some data just to give you a sense of this. So these are many of the towns that are in our in the study that we did. And so if blacks are if blacks are stopped at a rate that is exactly their share of the driving population, we'd be along that orange line. So any town that is close to that orange line is not showing any disparity in terms of stops of black drivers. Any town that is under this orange line is stopping black drivers at a rate that is below their share of the driving population. And any town that is above that is overstopping black drivers relative to their share of the population. And so, you would imagine, close to 100% is fine. Maybe 110, maybe 90 is fine. But what you see is that there are many towns, in fact, a significant number of towns, that are well over 150% of the traffic, their share of stops is 150% greater than their share of the driving population, suggesting some racial disparities for reasons we can't tell from this kind of aggregate analysis, but as any diagnostic tool, it tells you you have a problem that you should be looking into. Would you advance the next one? You might ask, why am I focusing on black drivers? And the reason is because racial disparities throughout the United States, in Vermont is no exception, tend to be worse the darker skinned the person. So blacks tend to have the worst outcomes, Hispanics next. Asians tend to be treated as a model minority, and what you see is exactly that pattern here. So again, this orange line tells you that this town is stopping drivers at exactly the share of Asians amongst the driving population, right? So any town that is close to that, and here we have Montpelier, Randolph is a little bit above that. But what you notice is that most towns are understopping Asian drivers, right? So this pattern in terms of racial disparities is race specific. It means that not all minorities are not treated the same, and there's sort of a hierarchy of treatment. I'm not really showing you the data on Hispanics, partly because there's a small sample size in a number of towns, and so what I'm really going to focus on in the rest of this presentation is largely a comparison between whites and blacks. So one of the other things that we find is that black drivers are arrested at a significantly higher rate than white drivers, and that is roughly at twice the rate of white drivers. One of the things that becomes apparent in this is, first of all, that towns police very differently, agencies police very differently, and that there are actually very different rules around when to arrest somebody and when not to arrest somebody. So for example, if you talk to the Vermont State Police, they'll tell you that they're more likely to arrest a driver subsequent to a stop if they think that driver is a flight risk. Well, if you have negative stereotypes about black drivers, for example, you may be more likely to arrest a black driver and to trust a white driver more, for example. And I'm sort of sharing with you what I know around issues around race in the United States. I don't know what is in the minds of the Vermont State Police. And again, these disparities tell us that what's important is to look deeper into practices at the agency level to understand why these disparities are occurring. But they are, in fact, very wide and very significant. And so, yeah, sure. The other thing that we found here, sorry about the color of the font, I should have just used black and white, is that black drivers are 4 times as likely, that is, they're 400% more likely to be searched subsequent to a stop than a white driver. And Hispanics are almost 3 times as likely to be searched subsequent to a stop as a white driver. In fact, Asians are less likely to be searched relative to white drivers, for example. This disparity of 4 times and 3 times is significant. And at the end of this slide presentation, I'm going to compare Vermont to many other parts of the country so that you can see how we are doing relative to others. So these are the statewide, just sometimes visuals are better than numbers, and so these are the search rates of stopped drivers. So 3.6% of black drivers are searched subsequent to a stop, compared to 0.9% of white drivers, 0.5% of Asian drivers, and 2.6% of Hispanic drivers, for example. Typically, when the police are doing a search of a vehicle, they're looking for contraband. That contraband might be, I don't know, a teenager with, alcohol, open containers. It might be drugs of a small or large quantity or stolen property. It is not guns, because it's not illegal to carry guns in Vermont. This shows you the difference amongst agencies in Vermont. These are the only agencies that we really had enough data on to say something with statistical surety. And so what you see, for example, is in Williston, black drivers are 2.2 times more likely to be searched than a white driver. But really, something that really stands out here is that in Rutland, black drivers are 6 times more likely to be searched than a white driver. So the issue around searches is that you're looking for contraband. And many of those folks that do research on racial disparities in policing will tell you that it's not just the search rate that matters, it's not just the search rate disparity. Maybe a particular group is more likely to be caught with contraband. And so what we should be concerned with, well, yeah, maybe there's an elevated search rate of some racial groups, but is contraband as likely to be found as it is with other groups? So on average, what you would expect if police are policing efficiently, they're going to get good at figuring out whether, in fact, the evidence that they observe is sufficient to do a search and that they're likely to find contraband. And so you'd expect hit rates, right, the percentage of cases in which contraband is found, to be roughly the same across all racial and ethnic groups. And what we found, in fact, was that whites and Asians are significantly more likely to be found with contraband than black or Hispanic drivers. And, you know, I sometimes think in my role as an academic, I think it's important for me not to dance around the issues. So let me just be clear about what I think is happening in Vermont. When you talk to the police about these data, what they often will tell you is that there's an opioid epidemic and that it is largely blacks and Hispanics who are bringing in opioids or dealing drugs. And that explains their disparate focus on black and Hispanic drivers. Now, if that were the case, we would expect the hit rates, right, the percentage of cases in which contraband is found, to be relatively elevated or at least equal to those of whites and Asians. And in fact, the fact that the hit rate is so much lower suggests that the police have a lower threshold of evidence for black and Hispanic drivers than they do, for example, for white and Asian drivers. And so when I say serious contraband here, we don't get data. The state has not yet required that we get specific data on what the contraband was. But we have a way of kind of figuring out how serious the contraband is. If the police search you, find contraband, maybe a 16-year-old with cigarettes, for example, they might give you a warning. They might give you a ticket if they find a little bit of marijuana, or if you're dealing drugs, most likely you're going to be arrested, right? So here, what we focused on were hit rates that only included tickets or arrests. So we ignored sort of the less serious cases of contraband being found because it really was unlikely to be, for example, drug trafficking that was the contraband that was found. So I want to go on and share with you some of Shelburne's data and compare it to some of the results from the state level, for example. So the legislature required several categories of data to be collected and reported annually. So the data that I was given when I contacted the Shelburne Police Department included roughly 4,000 stops. It was for this period, September 2014 to March 2017. And here's the percentage of data that was missing in each of the required categories. So for example, the race of the driver was missing in over 25% of the stops. The gender of the driver was pretty frequently recorded. The age was very infrequently recorded. The reason for the stop, which is very important in trying to assess racial disparities, was missing a great deal. The outcome of the stop is, are you getting a warning? Are you getting a ticket? Are you getting arrested? And so forth. That was pretty complete. And the data on searches and contraband were very seriously incomplete. Data analysis is only as good as the quality of the data. And missing data is important to fill in. A number of agencies in Vermont, when they did their first round of analysis, realized that they needed to train officers better to provide more complete data. And I'm hopeful that Shelburne will do that as well. If you could. So one of the issues with analyzing data is that you have to have a large enough sample size. So I'm going to just take you back to the medical analogy. So let's just say that you're monitoring your blood pressure, and let's just say you take your blood pressure twice during the year. is that a good indicator, especially if you have blood pressure problems, is that a good indicator of what your actual blood pressure is? Probably not. But if you measure it every single day, you're likely to get a good sense of what your actual blood pressure is, because of course it varies a little bit. It's the same thing with traffic data. You really need enough data to be able to say that your results aren't due to random variation, that you can say with statistical certainty that these are the results that you've obtained. So we have relatively limited data in Shelburne. A longer period of time would be useful to be able to say with certainty. But you know, my job as an economist and a person that works with numbers a lot is to be able to infer something from the data that at least should draw your attention about where there maybe should be some further investigation, and at a minimum that some areas that should be monitored. So I want to just give you that caveat that this data, the Shelburne data, hasn't been sort of run through the typical statistical tests that we typically run because of the size of the sample, but I think you'll see that there's some areas here that really deserve some attention. So for example, in the case of Shelburne, these are the shares of stops of each racial group. So whites were 92.9% of the 4,000 people stopped. These are the absolute numbers up here. Blacks were 4.2%, Asians 1.1%, and Hispanics 1.1%. As long as you have more than 20, you can say something with statistical certainty. So I'm comfortable with the stop rate data, but you'll see I'm not as comfortable sort of saying anything with certainty about some of the others. So this is the estimate of the driving share of the population based on the Department of Motor Vehicles data. Shelburne is a town where there are transients, that is, people drive through on the way to work and so forth. And so what we did was we used the Chittenden County estimates of not-at-fault drivers, reflecting the fact that there is a variety of people that drive through here as well. And so in this particular case, for Chittenden County, the share of blacks in the driving population is 2.9%. And as you will see, the percentage who are black or stopped is 4.2%. So blacks are stopped at a rate that's roughly 50% greater than their driving share of the population. Asians are understopped relative to their share of the population. If they were stopped at a rate that was equal to their share of the driving population, you would have had roughly 100 Asians who were stopped during this period of time. And as you can see, Hispanics have an even greater disparity between their stop rate and their share of the driving population.
Could you say a little more about driving population that's crash data?
Yes, so it's accident data that whenever there's an accident, the officer takes down an accident report, identifies the driver who's at fault, the not at fault driver, and indicates their perception of the race of the driver. And so we use the not at fault drivers as an estimate of the driving population. It's pretty much considered a best practice now in race research in the United States on traffic stops. So this is ticket rates of blacks versus whites in Shelburne, and so you'll see that 66% of white drivers stopped get a ticket compared to 74% of black drivers. That's a notable disparity. I want to say, I have to be a little bit lighthearted here because I know this stuff is heavy, but towns really do police very differently. In some towns in Vermont, 98% of all drivers are ticketed. So you're doing good in in Shelburne. It's not quite as, there's a little bit more leniency here. Nevertheless, there is this significant racial disparity. And you'll see that black drivers are also searched at a higher rate than white drivers. Now, there are only 3 searches of black drivers during this period of time. In the report that I sent to the town manager and the select board, you have the total numbers for all of these stops. So we can't say too much with certainty because the number of searches of black drivers is relatively small. But it certainly is an area in which one ought to focus attention. And it's something that should be monitored. And because it's consistent with the overstopping and the over-ticketing, you begin to see a pattern emerge in these data, even if there are relatively few data at this point. So this is a graph that shows you the percentage of white and black drivers who are found with contraband that leads to an arrest. And I wanted to compare this also to Burlington Police Department and Vermont State Police Department because, again, the patterns are fairly similar across agencies throughout the state. So the data for Burlington and for Vermont State Police are for 2016. They were not in the report that was shared with you. So in the case of Vermont State Police, 17% of searched white drivers were arrested, but only 8% of black drivers, despite the fact that black drivers were twice as likely to be searched as white drivers. So it suggests to you that there is some over-searching of black drivers for reasons that I can speculate on when we have a little bit of a discussion, and I'll just wait until then. In Burlington Police Department, 16% of all searched white drivers were arrested, suggesting there were probably some very serious contraband. 0% of black drivers who were searched at a rate that is roughly 3 to 4 times greater than of white drivers. And similarly in Shelburne, again, I just want to emphasize the small sample size, no black drivers who were searched were arrested, and 7% of white drivers were arrested. For me, this is probably the clearest evidence of racial disparities that is linked to implicit bias. And that is that the assessment of officers is influenced by the racial stereotypes that are not too unique to the police department, but that are in our schools and throughout US society. In many ways, we are no different than the rest of the country. And in fact, on that note, I wanted to compare for you how we stand relative to a number of other parts of the country in terms of search rate disparities. So the bar that you see here, and the number that you see is the black search rate, the percentage of black drivers searched divided by the percentage of white drivers searched. If that is equal to 1, there's no racial disparity. Anything above 1 suggests some kind of disparity that is leading to this over-searching of black drivers or perhaps under-searching of white drivers. So over here you see North Carolina State Police, Fayetteville, North Carolina. Winooski is down here at black drivers being searched at almost double the rate of white drivers. Aurora, Illinois, Illinois State, Greensboro, North Carolina. And as you move along here, you see at the top end, South Burlington, Rutland, Bennington, right next to Chicago, Vermont State Police, Burlington, and so forth. So the point I want to make with this, and I think the reason I've been compelled to continue to do this work, is there is a perception in Vermont that we don't face the same racial issues as the rest of the country, but the data suggest, in fact, that we may even have a worse problem than the rest of the country, and it's incumbent upon us to figure out what's going on and how to correct it. So this is just summarizes, being good professor mode. I just want to summarize what I said, that Black and Hispanic drivers experience disparate treatment relative to white and Asian drivers. It exists across most of the police departments that we evaluated, but to different degrees. In other words, agencies are not uniform in their disparities. Some have very small disparities and some very significant disparities. In many ways, these differences are also geographic as well. And what I am seeing is that the disparities are greatest along the borders of the state, the southern border and up here in Burlington. Is there another slide? I'm not going to talk too much about this. We made some recommendations, and certainly one that I would suggest to Shelburne as well is to invest some energy in improving the issue of missing data. And I want to say this isn't a criticism. This is very typical. Whenever any new data effort starts, there's often some sort of bottlenecks getting going. And so it's always good to get a report on your data early on so that you can address the deficiencies. And one of the things that I think has become clear in these data for me is that much of what we are observing is due to implicit bias. And that is around negative stereotypes that Americans have regarding people of color, in particular African Americans, and to a slightly lesser extent Hispanics, and that influences decision making. And the way to address that, perhaps the most important way, is to become aware of one's biases. and then to begin to be aware of those in the process of policing. But I will just leave it at that and answer any questions or happy to take any comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We appreciate you coming. So I'd like to turn it over to anyone who has a question. We have with us, so you know, Professor, we have our Chief of Police here, and we have, that's Jim Warden, we have Sergeant Al Fortin, and we have Officer Mike Thomas here. And we have Officer Bob Lake. Sorry. Chief.
I would like to say, part of the information that was missing, I totaled all the verbal warnings. I kept all those records. Once a month, they would turn in those to me. I understand that there was when we give a verbal warning on the ones that I give, that they give, they are listed, registration number, time, date, what the violation was, and the race, not a name. So any of those that didn't have a name on, there was a reason because they're verbal. And if they're given a written warning, that then goes into the state system. So we felt we were giving the motorists, because these are minor, we felt we were giving the public the benefit of the doubt that if they got stopped this month, that next month they may drift over the 10 miles or whatever it is. Most of us is 10 miles or better. That they might get a second shot at it without getting a ticket. So those, we didn't put the names down due to that fact. Now we go back to the other, not looking for excuses, but to tell you we were short a dispatcher. We had another one that was out for a while. And our dispatchers are the ones that put this in. My secretary retired. So we had frequently had our dispatchers able to, one of them is designated for that. And if they have 911 calls in no time, some of this won't get done. We are now going to written warnings, so everybody will not get any verbal warnings anymore. They'll get a written warning. It's on the back of the ticket. So I hope that the next time you look at this paperwork, we still have shortages in help, which is a major problem with us to handle everything, because sometimes those radios and the telephones don't quit. So maybe in the future we can get that taken care of with somebody else, but I apologize for that information not being there, but I don't like to give excuses. I think you're right. I don't know. About all the cars I stopped, I don't think I had a black motorist at all. And when they passed me coming up Route 7 or down Route 7 or somewhere at 60 miles an hour or whatever, I don't know what race they are until they get stopped. So, and at night, that's the same thing. You really don't know. But as far as searches, any search, most of our searches are done with a search warrant. There are some where if we smell the pot and they say we have nothing in there, we're here if you want to sign this release, and there's no pressure put on them at that point. But I don't know, what do we have? We had more than once where we got search warrants, but just a few, if any, and I don't even know what race they were with the others. So I want to apologize for that, but I can rest assured we're not biased. Thank you.
I want to thank you for that. And I want to just say that there were a number of departments that had incomplete data. And it became very obvious to me that a number of departments are really stressed in terms of administrative help. And I hope that, that the legislature and so forth will provide greater support to departments to be able to do a better, be able to collect more complete data. And I appreciate the verbal warnings. That probably explains a number of the missing observations because you weren't collecting that data on those verbal warnings. So just to say that we, in this analysis, we excluded any activity that was not at the discretion of the officer. So we excluded searches based on a warrant or arrests based on a warrant and externally generated stops, for those of you who know what that is. So we tried to just focus in, but thank you, that was helpful.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question or a comment? Please come to the microphone and identify yourself. No, we need the microphone. Sorry.
It's just
We have a lot of talent agents around here. You might be signed. Brad Pitt's looking for a new person.
I'm Linda Watts. I'm a resident in Shelburne. It sort of follows up a little bit on what Jim was, saying. When, and it's not to question in any way the significance of the study, which I think is important, but if I understood correctly in the beginning, you said that often an officer wouldn't know what the race was until after the stop. So how could you see my questions on this?
So my discussions with officers has been that for example, going down the highway, they may not. But for example, if they're parked in town, they might park near a street light. Or they may know the vehicle. This certainly happens in Burlington. But that's why we also focus on the post-stop outcomes where we do know the race of the driver. And I think I want to just say once again that the real, for me as an analyst, the issue is the pattern consistent across all of these indicators? And it's very consistent, right? It's not as if we have stop rates that are elevated, but arrest rates and search rates that are not elevated. We have disparities in all of these indicators. And as I said, my conversations with police tell me that under many conditions, there is enough light at night or wherever they're parked, or because they know the vehicles, that they know the race of the driver.
Thank you. Anyone else? Al, this is Al Fortin.
My only
Sergeant.
concern is, are you taking, especially because we have Route 7 and a few of those other towns have major roads, are you taking into consideration whether they're residents or they're out of state?
So the legislature has not yet required the police departments to report the state in which the vehicle is registered. I'd love to analyze that because that question comes up a lot. I was able to do it for South Burlington a couple of years ago, and what I found was that the racial disparities were no different, whether we looked at only out-of-state drivers or only in-state license plates. But, as I said, if we were able to get the data, we'd love to analyze that, yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you. And we have a lady in the back. And you're next. Please identify yourself, too. Hi.
Hi, Wendy Seville.
Hi, Wendy.
I volunteer with the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program. We have an increasing population of Bhutanese and also Burmese. I'm assuming they might be categorized as Asian, but do you know about the Bhutanese population?
That's a great question. We don't have, the data only combine Asians and into one group. And so we aren't able to disaggregate what might happen to somebody who looks Japanese versus Vietnamese versus Bhutanese.
So are you saying that you feel that the Bhutanese are considered Asian?
That's in terms of racial categories set by the federal government, they fall into that category.
Okay, and you feel the officers recognize that, say that Asian as opposed to Hispanic or Black or?
No, I
I'm
think
wondering
that
I'm wondering what the training is around that.
there is no training around perceived race of the driver. It might be interesting to do that, right? But it is incumbent upon the officer, because ultimately it's the officer's perception that is
Right.
going to influence how, how they conduct their business, for example, if in fact they take race into consideration. But I'll just tell you a few stories. I've done ride-alongs with many police departments, and in one of the officers told me that he categorized Japanese folks as white, for example. Some don't know how to categorize somebody who is Arab-looking, for example. And so that's why often in these analyses, it's less likely that the officer is going to mistake the racial identity of a driver if they're white or black. But anything in between actually may be subject to error. And as far as I know, there are no plans to train officers on their racial perceptions of the race of the driver. But I think your point is well taken, because, one of the big problems in the United States when we look at Asians and consider them a model minority, they have higher income than other racial groups and so forth, there's actually a huge disparity within Asians. So Cambodians and Laotians and so forth tend to have much worse outcomes than, for example, Japanese and South Koreans and so forth. But we don't have the data in terms of police data to really suss that out here.
Thank you, Professor. Just would like to add, our police department takes training extremely seriously. In Shelburne, I believe, and help me with the numbers, guys, but I believe our police department has approximately 10 times the amount of training that a state police officer goes through. I think we have 400 hours of training?
440 after FTO, after they complete the 16 weeks.
And the state police is approximately 10% of that. So we take the training aspect very seriously, and I think the part of this would be included in that training. And also, to the point how seriously the town takes this, we're just in the process of interviewing for a deputy chief, in which we asked 6 questions of the applicants. One of the questions, this is how important it is to the town and to our police department, was, as deputy chief, please explain your framework to ensure the Shelburne Police Department practices of fair and impartial policing. So this is something that that we're aware of, and we have a lot of training here, and we're taking it very seriously. Obviously, we invited you. We're not hiding. We bring it right out in the open here.
That's great.
So do we have other people who have a question? Please, and identify yourself for everyone.
Sure. My name is Robert Appel. I'm an attorney. I practice in Burlington. I was the executive director of the State's Human Rights Commission for 12 years, and prior to that was chief public defender, defender general for the state. I've been involved in this issue since the Uncommon Alliance was founded in 2003. At that time, Vermont was one of 2 states where no race data was being collected on motor vehicle stops, the other being Mississippi. So I'm glad to hear that we're moving forward. I'm glad to hear the commitment from this legislative body and from command staff in the police department. I do want to add a couple things. One is, Stephanie didn't talk about the context in which this discussion occurs, which is that over 10% of our prison population is comprised of African Americans, primarily men. The black population of Vermont is between 1% and 2%. So one has to question, how is it that there's that gross degree of disproportionality between incarcerated minorities and minorities in the community? In fact, we are the most disproportionate, us in Iowa. Iowa is also a very white state. So my theory, and I think it's subscribed to by others, is that because there are relatively few black people in Vermont, they tend to stand out more and attract more attention, not just from police, but also from community members who might call in and say there's suspicious characters hanging out in the park with their hats on sideways and baggy pants. Problem is, there's no indication that any of that is criminal. The other thing I want to reemphasize what Stephanie said about what happens post-stop is, to me, the most critical aspect of this. Yes, I fully understand and accept that officers often don't know who they're stopping until papers are exchanged and they're eyeball to eyeball. At that point in time, the officer is going to have some idea of who they're dealing with. So what happens after that fact, I think, is the critical component of the study. And unfortunately, the data shows gross variations in the degree of intrusiveness, length of stop, sanctions, et cetera. So I think we all have it. And, you know, I understand the chief's position. We don't want to be biased, but I think we all have to own up to we're socialized in this society. We all have our implicit biases. And I think it's dangerous not to recognize that. So I would ask, there's training and training. I'm glad to hear the department's doing training, but I think we really need to wrestle with our own internal demons and make sure we treat each citizen, each person we encounter in whatever profession we're in, with equal respect and as judgment-free as we can be. I'll stop there. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you very much. Is there someone else who has a question? Please come on up, identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Zoe Hart, and I understand that, the missing data and the staffing issues, and I was just wondering, you mentioned the legislative support at the state level. Is there anything we can be doing in Shelburne to make sure that we have the staffing in the police department so that we collect the data we need to collect?
Zoe, it's a great question. I will tell you, our police department is undergoing the possibility of some substantial changes that are unrelated to the study. And it's the possibility, because there's no decisions being made, but we have our active police officers, and we also have a dispatch department. We are one of, I think, 3 or 4 left PSAPs in the state. And there is a discussion within Chittenden County to regionalize dispatch. And if that happens, that's going to have a major impact on our police department. We don't know if the dispatchers will all be located here in Shelburne. Will they be in Burlington or Colchester, or we just don't know. So there are things that will come into play. There is data collection, which I've just learned the last 2 days. We use one system. We're considering switching over to a different system that might help capture the data. I can tell you that when we heard from Professor Seguino with data collection, Joe and I had some talks, and the Selectboard hasn't met as a whole on it until tonight. But we're very interested in trying to do our bit to satisfy and comply with the statutory requirements that changed, frankly, in the last year or so, where it is now mandated, whereas a year or 18 months ago, it wasn't mandated. I think that's right?
Yeah, I would say,
Yeah.
first of all, I do want to commend members of our police department to come here. I think that all of them took this seriously and are coming here because we want to be the best police department we can be. So, it takes a lot of courage for them also to be here. And, as soon as we figured out that our data collection, that we were being, I guess, a little bit loose in terms of giving verbal warnings and not recording them the way the legislature wanted, we fixed it the next day. So that's been fixed, and we're continuing to look at different trainings, and not just for the police department, but for all town staff. It's not just the police department in Shelburne who interact with the public. It's not just important for our police department to have bias-free training and things like this, but our library staff, town clerks, town manager, everyone. So this is not a let's focus on police officers type of thing in Shelburne. We're going to focus on everyone in the municipal team.
I'll tell you of another step. When we first heard of Professor's study, there was talk about, well, let's invite her here, which I thought was great. And I reached out to our vice chair, John Kerr, and I said, look, I think this is important. This needs to be part of a public meeting where statutorily the public has the right to come and participate and ask questions and make comments. So that's why we took the unusual step of starting our meeting tonight at 6 o'clock, because we thought this was an important enough topic that it should be part of the public agenda. And I joined Joe in commending these 4 officers with leadership by the chief to coming here. And I'm convinced if we have problems, our police department and our town staff, we want to address them. That's why we invited you here. We're not hiding. We want to address them. We want to fix them. Who's next? Please, come on up, identify yourself, and ask away.
My name is Deborah Davis. I'm here, part of the Social Service Committee also in Shelburne. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think it's a really important one. I think sometimes when this conversation gets opened up, there's a confusion around racism and implicit bias and unconscious bias. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about those differences so that
Sure, absolutely.
period.
Sure. I teach on this topic as well, and as you might imagine at UVM, most of my students are white, and I maybe have failed to acknowledge at the beginning of this is a difficult discussion, and race is a very difficult topic, especially for white folks who are not used to talking about it. And I'm hopeful that in talking about the race data, it is an opportunity to begin to normalize a discussion that, folks feel uncomfortable with, white folks often feel guilty about, and so on and so forth. So to your question, we can really think of, there's several ways that disparities occur and bias occurs, if you will. One is personal bias, right, and explicit. That is, I believe that some ethnic group or racial group is inferior to some other group, and therefore I am going to treat them differently. That really dominated thinking in our country for a long period of time. And in many ways, we've moved substantially beyond that. And so has the scientific community, right? Because this was fueled by the scientific community that made an argument for, intellectual inferiority and so forth. That no longer holds water. But what we are left with is unconscious bias. That is, bias that we may not be aware of. I was talking to a police chief who himself admitted to me his own implicit bias. We are influenced by the media. We are influenced by the television shows that we see. We are influenced by a variety of institutional patterns of poverty and so forth that lead to disparate life outcomes. So it's more a question of becoming aware of those biases. And I'm going to give you sort of a trivial example of, one of these. My father used to always say that women were worse drivers than men. So that's an explicit bias, right? And I think that, there are some people that may still believe that, but not, just think for some reason that men may be better drivers than women subconsciously, although they probably wouldn't dare to say it publicly anyhow if they did believe it, but haven't moved beyond that. And so implicit bias at the personal level influences our day-to-day activities. Who to hire, who to fire, which kids to kick out of the library at school, which kids to suspend, and which kids to give a slap on the wrist, for example. There's other forms of biases, institutional biases. And it means that there are rules within an organization that differentially impact one group versus another, even though it may not be conscious racial bias. So, for example, if, for example, police officers in Vermont stop a vehicle, they call the dispatcher looks to see if they have a prior violation and so forth. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I've learned on these ride-alongs. My father used to be a policeman too, so whatever he taught me, I remember. And so you hear on the radio that this person has already had 2 tickets. You're much more likely to give them a ticket than a warning because they've had repeated infractions. But what if that person has themselves been the recipient of racially biased policing in Vermont or elsewhere? So, you're following a practice in your department that is not racialized at all, but it's following on sort of the accumulation of racial biases that preceded that particular event. I think of that as unintentional bias, and I think all of our institutions have to be aware of whether our rules and policies and procedures are contributing to that. And then, of course, there's systemic bias, right? And so, I'm going to move away from race to make it a little bit easier for us to cope with. So, for example, we have high rates of poverty in the United States. And it could be, in fact, that folks who are poor have vehicles that are in very poor condition, and that attracts the attention of the police more than higher income groups who have better operating vehicles, for example. So poverty that happened elsewhere in another part of the system affects policing outcomes, not because officers are biased, but because racial inequality exists in all of our institutions. It exists, if you talk to kids of color in Burlington, they tell you how they're followed in the stores. They tell you how the police stop them in their own neighborhoods if they're in the Hill section, ask them what they're doing in that neighborhood. And there's a repeated types of microaggressions that occur throughout that, as I said, some are conscious, most are unconscious, some are wrapped into institutions, and some are just systemic that the police are dealing with because they're part of this broader system of inequality.
Thank you. I'd like to is there anyone else here? We're coming near our time frame. Lee, this is Lee Suskin in town.
This is a great presentation, and I'm glad we're doing this research because it is an important issue. I think you said the population of Vermont is about 1.5% black, and the prison population is 10%. So I'm curious, it's not just police, it starts with
That's right.
police.
That's right.
So I'm wondering, the police may or may not request a search warrant. You know, who's doing research on what percentage of search warrants are granted by race? Who's doing research on how bail is set by race? Who's doing research on who's incarcerated for lack of bail while they're presumed innocent? And then, of course, the sentencing themselves, and then violations of probation themselves. So is someone doing that research to look at the big picture, or is it just local police?
Thanks for that. It's a great question. I want to just say, on that question, there's a great book that was published a couple of years ago called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and I would encourage you all to read it because it talks about how it's not just, you know, the level of traffic policing, it's at plea bargaining, at selecting juries, and at sentencing, and many steps in the system. But I'm going to ask Robert Appel to answer your question because he is aware of a study that was done in Vermont. Is that not true? Max Shooter and the Criminal Research Group?
Yeah. Lee, thanks for your question. For those who don't know, Lee was formerly court administrator for the state of Vermont, so he's certainly familiar with these issues. Unfortunately, police are sort of the easiest to measure. No offense to you folks. You're the intake. This is relatively simple. You know, criminal justice outcomes are discretion upon discretion upon discretion upon discretion. Looking at your activity is pretty easy. Looking at how courts, which includes judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, correctional officers, probation officers, it gets pretty complex pretty quickly. There's been conversations over the last 15 years to take on that work. There have been little bits and pieces of it, little studies here and there. There was a group called Vermont Center for Justice Research, which is now Crime Research Group. Anyway, the number of little pieces are consistent with the data that Stephanie has presented with you to you tonight, which is there are documented disparities based on race in who gets to go to diversion, who successfully completes diversion, plea bargaining, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, it is rather complex, and I don't know of any overall systemic study that has really taken that on. I think we need to move in that direction. So thanks for your question.
Thank you. Just want to give everybody a chance before we wrap it up. Everyone, anyone in the select board have any comments or questions? Josh?
I just have one, and it's more following up on something that Robin said. That one of the more significant or interesting things I saw is that the discrepancy or the differentiation between search rates. In your data, or in the data that you've got, is there, trying to get a handle on why, are there comments about what considerations were, or what the rationale was for conducting a search once a stop has been made?
That data is not made available to us. Police departments, I assume that my understanding is that all searches have a record of what the evidence was, what the reasoning behind it and so forth was, but the legislature has not required any kind of reporting, public reporting of the causes. A number of police departments that have had disparate disparities in searches have gone back and looked at all of their searches to try to understand if there is something going on, if there are differences in sort of decision-making going on. And I wanted, if I could just close this by saying that these data are really, they really are for the police departments. They're really for them to help them understand what they're doing, to ask some questions of themselves. And the beauty of data is that you can use it you can evaluate your results year after year to see if you're making progress. Right? So you use the data to point you to where there are disparities to understand why they're happening, whether there needs to be training or what kind, and then you can monitor over time, is the training working? Are we in fact reducing these disparities? So I hope that one doesn't see these tools, the data, as a weapon. They are not. They are really a tool for all of us to use, but particularly for the police officers themselves to get a sense. And I've thought a lot about this as I've done this, that, you know, especially in towns that have a small minority population, you might only be stopping a few drivers of color a year, so you don't have a sense of the patterns that are going on in your department unless you do look at the data. So I hope that you will accept this report, and, you know, probably future reports I'll do is hopefully a tool for all of you to use rather than anything other than that. So I really appreciate your interest in this and your great questions.
Well, Professor, thank you
Thanks for
very
having me.
much for coming, and you and your research are always welcome to the show. All right, we're going to take about a 5-minute break before we continue our
Oh,
meeting.
thank you. Thanks.